They called her Grandma behind her back. Sometimes, when he was feeling particularly cruel, they called her Dusty, a name that clung to her like the sterile, antiseptic scent of the hospital halls she walked with a slow, deliberate pace. Dr. Preston Sterling, the Golden Boy chief of surgery at Metropolitan Trauma Center, actually placed a $500 bet that Sarah Miller wouldn't last the month. It was a running joke among the younger residents and the nurses who orbited him like sycophantic moons. Sarah, with her graying blonde hair pulled back in a severe, unfashionable bun and her oversized scrubs hiding a frame that looked like a strong Chicago wind could knock it over, seemed to them a relic from a bygone era of nursing. She moved with a plodding rhythm that drove the frantic, caffeine-fueled residents insane. Her hands, when she held a chart or a pen, possessed a faint, rhythmic tremor they mistook for age or nerves. Her bad knee, a legacy she never spoke of, would sometimes pop with an audible crack when she stood up, earning snickers from the nursing station. Dr. Sterling, handsome in a jagged, sharp way that suggested old money and an even older sense of entitlement, embodied everything Sarah was not. He was the son of a senator, a fact he let drop as casually as he checked the Rolex that gleamed on his wrist. His family had donated the entire West Wing. He wore his pristine white coat not as a uniform, but as a coronation robe, and the stethoscope draped around his neck was less a tool and more a piece of expensive jewelry. At 35, he was a prodigy of protocol, a master of the textbook, a god within the gleaming, sterile walls of his domain. He valued hierarchy, his own pristine image, and the rigid scaffolding of hospital policy above all else, especially above the messy, unpredictable business of human life. "Grandma, did you triple-check the expiration dates on the saline bags in Trauma 3? He'd call out, his voice booming across the ER, ensuring the maximum number of people could hear his benevolent correction. "We can't have our patients dying of sepsis just because someone's memory isn't what it used to be." The sycophantic chorus of giggles would follow on cue. Brittany Moore, a young nurse barely out of school, would duck her head and smile, her eyes flicking towards Sterling for approval. Sarah wouldn't respond. She would simply nod, her face a quiet mask of professionalism, and turn to recheck the dates she had already checked twice. The tremor in her hands would seem, for a moment, more pronounced. It was a quiet, grinding humiliation, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, administered daily with the precision of a surgeon. She needed the job. 20 years in this hospital, after a lifetime somewhere else, and she was just trying to make it to her pension, to a quiet life in a small apartment, where the only beeping came from the microwave. She thought her life, the one that mattered, was already over. She was just waiting for the epilogue to finish. She was wrong. The security camera footage from that Friday night at Metropolitan Trauma Center would later become the most watched video in the city's history. It captured the exact moment a quiet, tired 52-year-old nurse became the most dangerous person in the room. 1 second, she was a ghost in blue scrubs, wiping down a counter. The next, she was a wall of immovable force. The footage would be analyzed by tactical experts, by surgeons, by lawyers, all of them trying to understand how it happened, how the woman they called Grandma, the woman fired for gross insubordination, became a legend. Hours later, standing on a rainy street corner clutching a soggy cardboard box containing the last 2 decades of her life, Sarah Miller would feel the cold seep into her bones and think, "It's finally over." But as the world around her erupted in a symphony of sirens and the deafening roar of helicopter rotors, she would learn that her war was not finished. It had just followed her home. The cavalry was coming. And they weren't coming for the doctor. They were coming for the nurse. That Friday night began like any other Friday night in a major city's top-level trauma center. A relentless, chaotic ballet of human misery. A car crash victim, a gang-related stabbing, a homeless man with diabetic ketoacidosis. Sarah moved through it all with her usual unhurried grace. While residents scrambled and shouted, she calmly and methodically started IVs, drew blood, and charted vitals. Her deliberate slowness was, in reality, an economy of motion honed over decades. But to the untrained, frantic eyes of the young doctors, it looked like geriatric hesitation. Dr. Sterling was in his element. He strode through the emergency department like a conquering hero, a trail of residents and nurses trailing in his wake. He'd perform a flashy, textbook procedure, then hold court at the nursing station, recounting his own brilliance. See, the key to a successful pericardiocentesis is the angle of entry. He lectured a group of doe-eyed interns, conveniently omitting the fact that the charge nurse, Brenda Harrison, had been the one to first spot the cardiac tamponade on the ultrasound. Brenda, a woman in her 50s with arms like a dock worker and a face etched with the cynicism of 1,000 failed hospital administrators, just rolled her eyes and went back to her paperwork. She'd survived budget cuts, a pandemic, and 3 hospital strikes. She had no patience for peacocks like Sterling, but she also knew which battles to fight. A quiet, competent nurse like Sarah getting bullied was just another Tuesday. It wasn't right, but it was the weather. You didn't fight the weather. Around 10 o'clock, during a brief lull, Sterling found his favorite target. Sarah was restocking the pediatric crash cart, her movements precise. She was checking the delicate, tiny laryngoscope blades, ensuring they were clean and functional. "Sarah," Sterling's voice cut through the relative quiet. He leaned against the doorframe of the supply closet, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "I need you to go down to Central Supply and personally verify the lot numbers on our entire stock of 14-gauge angiocatheters. Cross-reference them with the recall list from last month." Sarah paused, her hands hovering over a set of neonatal paddles. "Doctor, I already did that this morning."
"They're clear."
Her voice was quiet, raspy, as if worn down from years of shouting over the din of engines and explosions she never spoke of. Sterling pushed off the doorframe and walked closer. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for Brittany and another nurse to hear. "I know you think you did, Sarah, but with those shaky hands, who knows if you wrote the numbers down correctly? A simple transposition could kill someone. Let's just call it quality assurance. A little double check for my own peace of mind." He winked at Brittany, who offered a weak, uncomfortable smile in return. The insult was exquisitely crafted. It questioned her competence, her physical ability, and her memory all in one go, wrapped in the guise of patient safety. It was a checkmate. To refuse was to seem insubordinate and careless. To obey was to accept the humiliation. Brenda looked up from her computer, her jaw tight. "Preston, her work is solid. Let her finish the cart. I can send a tech." Sterling waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense, Brenda. A little walk will be good for her. Keeps the joints from seizing up." He turned back to Sarah, his smile widening. "No rush, Grandma. It's a long list." Sarah's face remained impassive. Inside, a familiar, cold weariness settled in her gut. She thought of a dusty, sun-baked firebase in the Hindu Kush, of a young captain with an ego as big as Sterling's who had refused to listen to her about the placement of a tourniquet. That captain had lost his leg. Sterling was just costing her dignity. For now. She carefully placed the laryngoscope blade back in its sterile package. "Yes, doctor." She didn't look at him as she walked past. She could feel his smirk on her back like a physical weight. Her knee gave a slight twinge as she walked toward the elevators, a dull ache that pulsed in time with the fluorescent lights overhead. The tremor in her right hand, a constant companion since that day in Kandahar, felt a little worse. It was nerve damage, the price for holding a young ranger's femoral artery shut with her bare hands for 6 hours in the rubble of a collapsed building, refusing morphine so she could stay alert. The surgeons had told her she was lucky to keep the hand at all. Sterling saw it as a punchline. She passed Big Mike, the evening shift security guard near the main entrance. He was a mountain of a man in his late 60s, a former college football player whose gentleness was as immense as his frame. He saw the look on her face. "Don't you let that pretty boy get to you, Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He's got the title. You got the talent. Everyone who's been here more than 5 minutes knows it." Sarah managed a small, tired smile. "Thanks, Mike. Just doing my job." "Yeah, and his," Mike muttered as she walked away. She spent the next 45 minutes in the cavernous, chilly basement of Central Supply, meticulously copying down lot numbers she had already verified that morning. It was a demeaning, pointless task, designed for no other reason than to assert his dominance. She finished, handed the list to a bewildered clerk, and began the long walk back to the ER. She felt old. She felt tired. She felt done. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she didn't belong here anymore. This world of politics and egos was more exhausting than any firefight. She was halfway down the main corridor when the alarm went off. It wasn't a standard alarm. It didn't ring or beep. It screamed. A high-pitched, piercing klaxon that cut through the hospital's ambient noise and vibrated in the teeth. "Code Black, Code Black, Trauma Bay 1, ETA 2 minutes, military escort, this is not a drill." The voice on the intercom was tight, with a tension rarely heard, even here. The atmosphere in the hospital shifted instantly. The low-level hum of controlled chaos evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of collective breath. Code Black was reserved for mass casualty incidents or the arrival of a critically wounded, high-value target under federal or military protection. It meant the rules were about to change. Sarah felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline that was terrifyingly familiar. Her exhaustion vanished. Her pace quickened, the limp in her step all but gone. Her mind, foggy with humiliation just moments before, was now crystal clear, running checklists she hadn't consciously accessed in years. She reached the ER just as the automatic doors burst open with a pneumatic hiss, slamming against their stops. The entrance wasn't filled with paramedics in blue. It was a wedge of olive drab and black. 2 armed military police officers in full combat gear entered first, their rifles held at a low ready, their eyes scanning the room with a terrifying predatory focus. They moved like wolves, clearing the space, their presence a stark and brutal intrusion into the civilian world. Behind them, 4 paramedics hustled the gurney, their movements frantic but efficient. Flanking them were more MPs, creating a moving perimeter of armed force. On the gurney was a man. He was huge, a giant even when lying down, his body a canvas of blood, dirt, and shredded tactical gear. An IV bag was held high, its contents a shocking dark red, whole blood, not saline. A paramedic was manually bagging him, his hand squeezing the ambu bag in a desperate, rhythmic pulse. 38-year-old male, multiple GSWs to the shoulder and upper torso, 1 to the neck. Vitals are crashing. BP 60 over palp. Heart rate 40 and falling. We're losing him, a paramedic shouted, his voice cracking with strain. Dr. Sterling, who had been preening by the nurses' station, was suddenly galvanized. This was the moment he was born for. A high-stakes, high-profile trauma. An audience. He strode forward, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape. "Bring him to Bay 1, now!" he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "I want a full trauma panel, X-ray, and get the OR prepped. Page cardiothoracic. Let's move, people!" The team swept past Sarah and into the largest of the trauma bays. She instinctively fell back, her role in these situations long established. Stay out of the way, anticipate needs, restock supplies. She grabbed a handful of gauze and packages of sutures from a supply cart, her mind working on a different level than everyone else's. She wasn't listening to the shouting. She was watching the patient. The bay was a storm of activity. Nurses and residents swarmed the gurney, cutting away the remains of the man's uniform. Sterling was at the head, barking orders. "Look at this bleeding from the neck. It's arterial. Get me direct pressure and pack it with hemostatic gauze. I need suction in here. Someone get a line in his other arm," he yelled. The wound in the man's neck was dramatic, blood pulsing in a weak but steady rhythm. It was a visual magnet, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. It was the obvious injury, the loudest one. Sterling, a man who operated on the obvious, was fixated on it. Sarah stood near the doorway, her eyes narrowed. She ignored the blood. Blood was a distraction. It was noisy. The quiet killer was almost always something else. Her gaze was fixed on the man's chest and neck. His chest rose and fell asymmetrically with each squeeze of the ambu bag. The left side barely moved at all. His neck veins, even with the low blood pressure, were starting to bulge, distended like thick cords. And then she saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible detail that made the cold dread in her stomach clench into a fist of ice. His trachea, the cartilage of his windpipe just visible in the hollow of his throat, wasn't in the center. It was shifted, pushed almost a full 2 centimeters to the right. Tension pneumothorax, a one-way valve leak in the lung. With every breath forced into him, air was filling his chest cavity, compressing his good lung, his heart, his great vessels. The blood pressure wasn't dropping just from blood loss. His heart was being squeezed to a stop. He wasn't dying from the bullet wound in his neck. He was suffocating internally, drowning in air. The neck wound was a red herring, and Sterling had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice quiet but clear, trying to cut through the noise. She spoke to the nearest resident, a young man named David Park. "Look at his trachea. It's deviated. There are no breath sounds on the left." Dr. Park glanced at her, his expression annoyed. "Dr. Sterling has it, Sarah. Just keep the supplies coming." He turned back to the chaos, eager to prove his worth to the chief. The patient's monitor let out a shrill, piercing alarm. "Oxygen saturation is down to 75%, a nurse shouted. "He's going into VTAC." "Push 100 of Lido," Sterling commanded, his focus still locked on the neck wound, which a resident was now furiously packing with gauze. "Damn it! Why isn't his pressure coming up? Give him another unit of blood!" They were going to kill him. They were treating blood loss while he was dying of pressure. Sarah moved, stepping fully into the bay. She walked directly toward Sterling. "Dr. Sterling," she said, her voice louder this time, sharper. "It's a tension pneumo. You need to decompress his chest. Now." Sterling didn't even look at her. He was wrestling with a suture kit, his movements becoming frantic as the monitor's alarms grew more insistent. "Get out of my way, nurse. Can't you see I'm trying to save this man's life? Go restock something." He waved her away with a flick of his bloody glove. "Brittany, get her out of here. She's contaminating my field." Brittany Moore took a hesitant step toward Sarah. "Sarah, maybe you should—" Sarah didn't even register the younger nurse's presence. Her eyes were locked on the monitor. The beautiful, jagged rhythm of ventricular tachycardia had collapsed into a slow, wavy line. Bradycardia. His heart was giving up. His lips, visible around the intubation tube the anesthesiologist was now struggling to place, were a deep, horrifying shade of violet. "Look at his neck, you idiot!" Sarah's voice wasn't quiet anymore. It was a raw, powerful command that cracked through the noise of the trauma bay like a rifle shot. The room fell silent for a fraction of a second. Every head turned. Sterling's face, which had been pale with panic, flushed with crimson rage. He finally turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "You are finished," he hissed, his voice low and shaking with fury. "You will not work in this hospital or any other when I am done with you." "Security!" he bellowed. "Get this woman out of my trauma bay!" But no one moved. Big Mike was at the ER entrance, but he was blocked by the MPs, who stood like stone sentinels, their faces grim. Everyone else was frozen, caught between the chief of surgery's fury and the undeniable terror of the dying man on the table. Sarah looked at the soldier. His eyes, barely open, were rolled back in his head. She saw the faded tribal tattoo on his forearm, the kind the teams got in faraway places. She saw the calloused hands of a warrior. She saw a man who had fought for his life on some dusty battlefield, only to die here, in a state-of-the-art trauma bay, because of the monumental ego of a man who'd never seen a real wound in his life. The oath she had sworn as a nurse, to do no harm, collided with the other oath she had taken, the one sworn as an officer in the United States Army, to never leave a fallen comrade. In that moment, her career, her pension, her quiet future, all of it turned to dust. It was weightless, insignificant. There was only the mission. She dropped the handful of gauze she was holding. It fell to the floor with a soft, unnoticed thud. Her entire posture changed. The stooped, tired nurse vanished. She stood up straight, and for the first time, the people in the room saw that her small frame wasn't fragile. It was coiled, dense with a power they couldn't comprehend. The quiet deference in her eyes was replaced by a look of glacial, lethal authority. She took one step toward the supply cart. "I said get her out!" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking. He took a step to intercept her, reaching out to grab her arm. Sarah didn't even glance at him. As he reached for her, she dipped her left shoulder and pivoted. It wasn't a push or a shove. It was a tactical block, a movement designed to use an opponent's momentum to clear a path. Her elbow, rigid as iron, connected with Sterling's chest. The much larger man stumbled backward with a grunt of surprise, tripping over a discarded biohazard bag and landing hard on the floor. He sat there, stunned, his mouth agape, looking up at her as if she had grown a second head. The room was utterly silent now, save for the dying bradycardic beep of the heart monitor. Beep, 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 each one slower than the last. Sarah's hand shot out and plucked a 14-gauge angiocatheter from an open pack on the cart. It was a single fluid motion, terrifying in its precision. She ripped the plastic cap off with her teeth and spat it to the side. She turned to the gurney. She didn't run. She moved with an explosive efficiency that was more intimidating than any sprint. She was beside the patient in 2 long strides. "What in God's name are you doing?" the anesthesiologist whispered, his hands frozen above the patient's face. Sarah didn't answer. She placed her left hand on the soldier's chest, her fingers palpating the skin with a firm, practiced pressure. The tremor was gone. Her hands were as steady as granite. Her thumb and forefinger found their mark instantly, without hesitation. The second intercostal space, just below the clavicle, in line with the middle of the bone. It was a landmark she could find in total darkness, in the back of a bucking helicopter, with blood and rain making everything slick. It was a map she had memorized through repetition and horror. With her other hand, she raised the long, thick needle. "Stop her! She's going to puncture his lung!" Sterling scrambled to his feet, shouting, a crazed look in his eyes. But he was too late. With a firm, downward thrust, Sarah drove the needle into the soldier's chest. It went through skin, fat, and muscle. There was a faint, visceral pop as the tip pierced the parietal pleura. And then came the sound, a loud, undeniable hiss. It was the sound of life. The sound of 100 pounds per square inch of trapped air screaming its way out of the tiny catheter. It was a sound audible throughout the entire trauma bay, a sound that cut through the silence like a verdict. The effect was instantaneous and breathtakingly dramatic. The soldier's chest, which had been unnervingly still on the left side, suddenly rose with a deep, shuddering symmetrical gasp. The distended veins in his neck flattened. The violet color of his lips faded to pink. On the monitor, the slow, dying wave of the heart rate exploded back into a steady, healthy sinus rhythm. The oxygen saturation numbers, which had hovered in the deathly low 70s, began to climb with astonishing speed. 80, 85, 90, 94, 98. The alarms fell silent. The only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic beep of a stable heartbeat and the collective, ragged breathing of 20 stunned medical professionals. Sarah held the catheter in place with one hand, her expression unreadable. She took a roll of tape from a nearby tray and expertly secured the plastic hub to the man's chest. Her work was done. The adrenaline began to recede, and the familiar tremor returned to her fingers. Her knee throbbed. She leaned against the gurney for a moment, her own breathing a little shaky. She had just thrown away her career, assaulted her boss, and performed an unauthorized, invasive procedure on a patient. The soldier on the table stirred. His eyes, which had been rolled back, were now open and lucid, though clouded with pain. He tried to turn his head, his gaze sweeping past the stunned face of Dr. Sterling, past the wide eyes of the residents, past the gaping mouth of Brittany Moore. His eyes searched the room until they found Sarah. He couldn't speak around the tube in his throat. He was weak, his body a wreck. But recognition dawned in his eyes, a deep, profound respect. He knew. In the way that soldiers know, he understood what had just happened. He knew who had seen the real enemy and who had been fighting ghosts. He lifted his right hand. It shook with a palsy of shock and blood loss, a far more violent tremor than Sarah's. With an expression of supreme effort, he slowly, deliberately, brought his hand to his forehead in a formal military salute. He held it there, his eyes locked on hers. Then, through the oxygen mask and around the tube, his lips formed a single, raspy, whispered word. A name. A call sign. A legend whispered in the dust of forgotten fire bases and the sterile corridors of military hospitals, from Landstuhl to Walter Reed. Angel. The room went deathly silent. The two MPs by the door, who had been watching with grim impassivity, both snapped to attention, their posture ramrod straight. Sterling stared, his face a mask of disbelief. What? What the hell just happened? He stammered. Sarah looked from the saluting soldier back to the disgraced doctor. Her face was a blank canvas, but her eyes were like chips of ice. He's stable, she said, her voice flat and utterly devoid of triumph or emotion. Do your job, doctor. She peeled off her bloody gloves, dropped them into a biohazard bin, and turned. Without another word, she walked out of the trauma bay, pushing past the frozen, staring crowd, her limp more pronounced than ever. She left behind a saved life, a shattered ego, and a legend reborn in the fluorescent glare of Trauma Bay 1. Quick pause. If this story is making your blood boil at the injustice Sarah faced, show your support by hitting the like button below. Trust me, the karma that's coming for Dr. Sterling is absolutely worth waiting for. Now, let's continue. The hour that followed was a blur of bureaucratic vengeance. Sarah didn't go back to the nurses' station. She went to the small, windowless break room, sank into a cracked vinyl chair, and waited. She knew what was coming. The coffee she poured tasted like ash. Her hands shook, not from nerve damage this time, but from the massive adrenaline dump. She had saved a life and ended her own career in the same instant. It was a trade she'd make again without hesitation, but the finality of it settled on her like a lead blanket. Brenda found her there 10 minutes later. The charge nurse's usually cynical face was unreadable. She wordlessly handed Sarah a fresh cup of coffee, this one with cream and sugar, just how she liked it. "The patient's name is Commander Davis," Brenda said, her voice low. "Navy SEAL, some kind of big shot. They've got him stabilized and are taking him up to the surgical ICU. Sterling is trying to take credit, telling everyone he diagnosed it just as you interfered." Sarah took a sip of the coffee.
It was hot and sweet.
"Of course he is. The administrator, Henderson, wants to see you. HR conference room. Now," Brenda added, her voice softening. "Sarah, what you did in there, I've been a nurse for 30 years. I've never seen anything like it. That block, where did you learn to do that?" Sarah looked down at her trembling hands. "A long time ago, in another life." "Well," Brenda said, her voice thick with an emotion Sarah had never heard from her before. "For what it's worth, thank you." The walk to the administrative wing felt like a march to her own execution. Harold Henderson, the hospital administrator, was waiting for her in a plush conference room with a mahogany table that gleamed under cold fluorescent lights. He was a man who sweated easily, and whose primary function was to protect the hospital from liability. Beside him, in a fresh set of scrubs and a starched white coat, sat Dr. Preston Sterling. His face was a mask of practiced victimhood and righteous indignation. A third person, a severe-looking woman from Human Resources, sat with a file open before her. Sarah was offered a chair. She remained standing. "Sarah," Henderson began, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief despite the room's chill. "We have a very serious situation here. Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint. He alleges that you physically assaulted him and then performed a dangerous, unauthorized procedure on a patient, against his direct orders." Sterling spoke, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "She was unstable, a danger to the patient and the staff. I was in the process of managing the patient's hemorrhagic shock when she attacked me from behind. Her reckless intervention could have punctured his heart or severed his subclavian artery. It's a miracle he survived her assault. I had to immediately intervene to correct the damage she caused." It was a masterful lie, constructed to reframe his incompetence as her insanity. The HR director began to read from the file in a monotone drone. "Gross misconduct, insubordination, physical assault on an attending physician, violation of chain of command protocols, reckless endangerment." Sarah listened, her expression unchanging. It was all just noise. The only signal that mattered was the steady beep of the monitor she could still hear in her head. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Henderson asked, his tone suggesting he hoped she wouldn't. Sarah finally looked at him, her gaze steady. "The patient is stable, isn't he?" Henderson blinked, thrown off. "Well, yes, but that's beside the point." "No," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "That is the only point." Sterling scoffed. "This is exactly what I mean. Delusional. She has no respect for protocol or authority. She belongs in a psychiatric evaluation, not a hospital." "Fine," Sarah said. The word was soft, but it landed with the weight of a stone. She wasn't going to fight. She wasn't going to beg. They had already made their decision. "I'm done." Henderson looked relieved. He slid a pre-written termination letter across the polished table. "Effective immediately. Your employment at Metropolitan Trauma Center is terminated. You will be escorted from the premises. We will be reporting this incident to the State Nursing Board and recommending a full revocation of your license." Sarah looked at the letter, then at Sterling's smug, triumphant face. She had one last question. "When you check on him," she asked, her voice chillingly calm, "will you tell Commander Davis that you were the one who saved him?" Sterling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Of course, someone has to maintain the patient's confidence in his care team. Sarah nodded slowly. She turned to leave. Big Mike was waiting outside the door. His face was a mask of quiet fury and profound sadness. He held an empty cardboard box. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. "This ain't right." "It's okay, Mike," she said, taking the box. "Watch that blood pressure of yours." The walk back to the locker room was the true walk of shame. Nurses and residents she had worked with for years suddenly found the floor fascinating. They wouldn't meet her eyes. They knew the injustice of it, but they also knew that Sterling's wrath was a fire that could consume anyone. Their silence was the price of their own survival. She packed her things. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's okayest nurse." A well-worn stethoscope she had bought with her own money. A dying succulent from the nurse's station. And at the bottom, a small framed photograph of her late husband, Tom, in his army dress uniform, his smile young and full of life. The contents of 2 decades fit into a box that wouldn't fill the passenger seat of a car. Big Mike walked her to the front entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a whoosh, revealing a city weeping a cold, miserable October drizzle. "You take care of yourself, you hear?" Mike said, his voice thick. "You too, old friend," Sarah replied. She stepped out into the rain. The doors slid shut behind her, sealing her off from the world that had been her life. Her car was in the shop, a repair she couldn't really afford. She began the 6-block walk to the bus stop. The rain quickly plastered her thin hair to her forehead and soaked through her jacket. The cardboard box grew heavy, its corners beginning to soften and sag. She clutched it to her chest, trying to protect the photo of Tom from the damp. She huddled under the flimsy shelter of the bus stop, shivering. The streetlights cast long, distorted reflections on the wet pavement. She saw her own reflection in the plexiglass of the shelter. A tired, drenched old woman clutching a box of junk. A failure. It wasn't an angry thought, just a heavy, suffocating fact. It was over. Her knee throbbed in a painful rhythm that matched the squeak of the windshield wipers on a passing car. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she was just a stubborn old nurse who didn't know her place. He would press charges. There would be a police report. She would lose her certification. She'd end up greeting customers at a big box store if she was lucky. No one would ever know what she had done. No one would ever know who she had been. That was when she heard it. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling. A low, deep thrumming that vibrated up through the soles of her shoes and rattled the plexiglass of the bus shelter. The puddles on the street began to ripple, not from the rain, but from something else. The thrumming grew, resolving itself into a sound the city wasn't supposed to make. Thwop, 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 thwop. The deafening percussive roar of heavy helicopter rotors, low and getting lower. Pedestrians on the street stopped, their umbrellas tilting upward. Cars slowed, drivers craning their necks. Sarah looked up, wiping the rain from her eyes. The low grey clouds were being torn apart by 2 monstrous shapes descending from the gloom. 2 UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, painted a non-reflective matte black, were dropping out of the sky, their searchlights cutting brilliant white cones through the downpour. They weren't heading for the hospital's rooftop helipad. They were coming for the street. With a precision that defied belief, the lead helicopter flared and settled onto the 6-lane intersection in front of the hospital, its landing gear touching down with impossible delicacy. The downdraft hit the street like a hurricane, inverting umbrellas, sending trash cans rolling, and plastering Sarah against the back of the bus shelter. Simultaneously, the street erupted in a cacophony of screeching tires. A convoy of black Chevrolet Suburbans and olive-drab military Humvees materialized out of the traffic, boxing in the intersection. Men in dark suits and soldiers in full combat gear leaped out before the vehicles had even stopped moving, establishing a perimeter with tactical speed. The flashing red and blue of police cars, which had just arrived, was swallowed by the overwhelming presence of federal and military force. The entire block was on lockdown. People were screaming, scattering, assuming it was a terrorist attack. News vans seemed to materialize out of thin air, their cameras turning toward the impossible scene. From the second Black Hawk, which hovered 50 feet above the street, a rope dropped. Figures began to fast rope down with terrifying speed. This wasn't a medical evacuation. This was an assault. Sarah stared, her mind struggling to process the scene. Through the rain and the swirling chaos, a side door on one of the lead Suburbans opened. A figure emerged. He was an older man, tall and lean, with a full head of silver hair. He wore a simple civilian windbreaker, but he moved with an unmistakable aura of command. He didn't run from the rain. He walked through it as if it wouldn't dare touch him. He was flanked by a wall of Secret Service agents, but his presence alone filled the space. As he stepped into the light of a street lamp, Sarah saw the 4 silver stars gleaming on the collar of the uniform beneath his jacket. A 4-star general. In the chaos, one of the soldiers who had rappelled from the helicopter pointed, not at the hospital, but directly across the street, directly at the bus stop. "Target acquired! Target in the rear!" His voice crackled over a radio. Before Sarah could react, another soldier broke from the perimeter and sprinted across the street, dodging the now stalled traffic. He was young, carrying his rifle at a low ready, his movements fluid and deadly. He ran straight for her. He stopped 5 feet from the bus shelter, his eyes scanning her, then the soggy box in her arms. "Ma'am, are you Sarah Miller?" he asked, his voice urgent but respectful. Sarah could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. "You need to come with us," he said, his voice a firm command. "Right now." He reached out, not to grab her, but with a hand open, waiting. The general had crossed the street now, his entourage parting the sea of chaos around him. He stopped in front of her, his eyes, a piercing blue, taking in her soaked clothes, her tired face, the pathetic cardboard box. A flicker of something, anger, sadness, recognition, crossed his face. "You're a hard woman to track down, Dusty," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Dusty. No one had called her that in 15 years, not since Tom. "General," she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. "General McChrystal." "They told me you were fired," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That ends now." He nodded to the soldier. "Get her things." "No," Sarah said, clutching the box tighter. "The box comes with me." The general's eyes softened for a second. "All right, Dusty. The box comes too. But we have to go. We have a matter of public record to correct." Inside the hospital lobby, Dr. Preston Sterling was at the height of his glory. The news crews had set up their cameras, and he stood before them at a hastily arranged podium, his face a mask of humble heroism. The administrator, Harold Henderson, stood beside him, beaming. "It was a tense situation," Sterling was saying, his voice smooth as silk. "The patient, a decorated American hero, was fading fast. His injuries were complex. While my team worked to control the bleeding, my experience allowed me to spot the subtle signs of a developing tension pneumothorax. It was a matter of seconds. I was able to perform a needle decompression just in the nick of time." A reporter shouted a question. "Doctor, there are rumors that a nurse interfered, that she was fired. Can you comment?" Sterling's face adopted a look of solemn regret. "Yes. Regrettably, one of our older nurses, a woman who I believe was suffering from some sort of episode, became agitated and attempted to interfere. She was unstable. My first priority was to ensure patient safety, so she was removed. We have to be vigilant. It's a tragedy, but the important thing is that the patient is safe and recovering. It was at that exact moment that the main entrance doors flew open. General Thomas McChrystal, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, strode into the lobby, flanked by two armed MPs. Sarah Miller, soaked and clutching a soggy cardboard box, was right behind him. The lobby fell silent. Cameras swiveled. Sterling's jaw dropped. General McChrystal walked directly to the podium, ignoring the sputtering Henderson. He stood beside Sterling, who looked like he had seen a ghost. "I was watching your press conference on my way over, Doctor," the general said, his voice amplified by the microphones. It was a calm, conversational tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "It was fascinating. You just told the nation that you saved Commander Davis's life. You also said that a nurse, Sarah Miller, was fired for instability." He turned and looked directly at Sterling. "When my godson, Commander Davis, radioed in from the field, critically wounded, he had one request. He didn't ask for the best trauma center in Chicago. He didn't ask for the chief of surgery. He asked one question. Is Dusty still there?" The general held up a thin black folder with the Department of Defense seal on it. "I'm here to correct the record." He opened it. "Do you know who Sarah Miller is, Dr. Sterling?" he asked the silent room. He didn't wait for an answer. He began to read, his voice clear and resonant. "Retired Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller, United States Army Medical Corps, 24 years of service, attached to Joint Special Operations Command for the last 10. Sterling's face had gone from smug to shocked to ashen white. 6 tours of duty, 3 in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan. Served in Fallujah, Ramadi, the Korangal Valley, and Helmand Province." The general paused, letting the names hang in the air. "She is the recipient of the Bronze Star with Valor, the Army Commendation Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, and a Purple Heart with an oak leaf cluster." He looked up from the folder, his eyes finding Sterling's. "And this," he tapped the page, "the Distinguished Service Cross, our nation's second highest award for valor, awarded for her actions during Operation Red Talon in Kandahar." He looked back at the file. "She is legendary in the special operations community as the Angel of Kandahar, a name she earned after she performed a field cricothyrotomy on a Delta Force operator with a ballpoint pen and a pocket knife in the middle of a firefight, a name she solidified when she held a young ranger's severed femoral artery closed with her bare hands for 6 consecutive hours in the rubble of a building collapse, refusing evacuation and morphine so she could continue to direct care for 3 other wounded soldiers until they were all extracted." McChrystal closed the folder with a soft snap. He looked at Sterling, his eyes burning with cold fire. "The faint tremor in her hands that you and your staff mock? It's permanent nerve damage from that day. Her limp, the one you find so amusing? A shattered knee from a mortar blast in the Kunar province, an injury she sustained while shielding a wounded Marine with her own body. You didn't have an unstable nurse in your trauma bay, Doctor. You had a living legend. You had the finest combat trauma specialist of her generation, and you fired her for doing the one thing she has done better than anyone on this planet for 30 years, saving the lives of American heroes." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic clicking of cameras. Sterling stood there, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. His polished, arrogant veneer had not just cracked, it had been atomized. The general turned to the sweating, trembling administrator. "Mr. Henderson, I have already been on the phone with the Secretary of Defense and Senator Sterling. Your father," he added, glancing at Preston, "was deeply apologetic. He sends his regrets that he cannot intervene, A federal investigation into this hospital, its billing practices, and several other convenient deaths over the past few years is being opened. Effective immediately. Henderson's face crumpled. He pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a pre-written termination letter. He had come prepared to sacrifice Sarah. Now he turned to his golden boy. "Dr. Sterling," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Effective immediately. Your privileges are suspended. The board has voted to terminate your contract, pending the outcome of the federal investigation." Sterling just stared, his world collapsing around him in real time. General McChrystal looked past him, his eyes finding Sarah, who stood quietly by the door. "Colonel," he said, his voice softening, all business gone. "It's good to see you." "You too, Tom," she said, a small, weary smile finally touching her lips. Then a movement near the security desk. Big Mike stepped forward. He walked past the stunned reporters, past the frozen hospital staff, and stopped in front of the man who had been a god just 10 minutes earlier. In his hands, he held an empty cardboard box. He held it out to Sterling. His face was grim, but his eyes held a deep, profound satisfaction. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the silent lobby. "It's a bit small, but I think you'll manage." 1 year later, the rain was gone. The Chicago sun, a rare and precious commodity in autumn, glinted off the newly installed brass letters on the front of the hospital's west wing. The Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller Center for Trauma and Emergency Medicine. A crowd was gathered on the lawn for the dedication ceremony. In the front row sat General Thomas McChrystal, his uniform gleaming. Beside him sat a healthy, smiling Navy SEAL commander, a faint, pale scar just visible at the collar of his dress blues, a badge of honor. On the podium, Sarah Miller stood not in scrubs, but in a simple, professional suit. She was the new Director of Patient Care and Safety, a position created specifically for her, with the authority to overhaul protocols, hire, fire, and fundamentally reshape the culture of the hospital. The past year had been a whirlwind. Dr. Preston Sterling, after a swift and brutal federal investigation, had his medical license permanently revoked. He had pled guilty to charges of insurance fraud and obstruction, and was now serving a 5-year sentence in a minimum security federal facility. His name had become a cautionary tale whispered to new residents, a ghost of hubris haunting the halls he once ruled. Harold Henderson had been forced into early retirement. The hospital, under new management and Sarah's fierce, quiet guidance, was transformed. The mortality rate in the trauma department had dropped by 15%. The culture of fear was replaced by a culture of empowerment. Nurses were encouraged, required, to speak up, to question, to be advocates, not servants. Sarah finished her short, humble speech. She spoke not of herself, but of the nurses, the techs, the paramedics, the people who did the real work. "A title on a door doesn't make you a leader," she concluded, her voice steady and clear. "Trust earned from your patients and your team is the only authority that matters. This name on the wall isn't about me. It's a promise. It's a promise that in this hospital we will always, always put the patient first." As the applause echoed, she stepped down from the podium. A young nurse, barely a year out of school, approached her nervously, clutching a tablet. "Ma'am, Director Miller," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I have a patient in Bay 2, a construction worker, and his pressure is dropping, but his heart rate is staying low. The resident thinks it's a vasovagal response, but I don't know. Something feels wrong. I'm probably just being paranoid." Sarah looked at the young woman's earnest, worried face. She saw the same uncertainty she had felt a lifetime ago. She saw the fear of being wrong, of being humiliated. She placed a gentle hand on the nurse's arm. The tremor was still there, a quiet reminder of the price of saving lives. "It's never paranoid to be careful," Sarah said, her voice warm. "Let's go take a look together." She smiled, a genuine reassuring smile that reached her eyes. "Tell me his name, and then tell me what your gut is telling you. From now on, in this hospital, we listen to our gut." She turned to General McChrystal and gave him a small nod, a silent thank you that spanned decades and continents. Then she walked back toward the hospital entrance, the young nurse at her side, her stride even and sure. She walked not as a relic, but as a guardian, back to the place where the real work was done, leaving the sunlight and the applause behind for the familiar fluorescent hum of the emergency room. Her war was finally over. A new, more peaceful one had just begun.